So welcome to this joint EOSCpilot LIBER webinar on ethical issues and skills in the European Open Science Cloud. My name is Kevin Ashley from the Digital Curation Centre. I'm going to be moderating this webinar today. And we've got three speakers, each of whom are going to speak for something between 10 and 15 minutes, after which we'll take questions from attendees. And I'll give you some guidance in a moment on how we're going to manage that process of getting the questions. Our three speakers today, in the order we're going to hear from them, are Serena Battaglia from Ekrin, Thordis Sveinsdottir from the Digital Curation Centre, and Libby Bishop, who's now at the Jesus Leibniz Institute for Social Sciences. The webinar is being recorded. All of you will get a link to the recording shortly after this finishes. The slides are going to be made available on Zenodo. If they aren't there already, they will be shortly, and there'll be a link in the chat box for that. And I'm sure we'll also get that link sent out to you. And we'd encourage you to use the chat box to put the questions. It'll be my job to monitor those and select from them and put them to our speakers at the end of the webinar. So, and in the meantime, I'll be monitoring the chat just to pick up on any issues and hopefully be able to respond to your questions as well. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Serena.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. So let's get started. I will give you a short introduction about EOSC and the work we have done in terms of ethics. So, as you may know, the European Open Science is the vision of the European Commission of a large infrastructure to support and develop open science and innovation in Europe. And in that sense, EOSC will be a pan-European federation of research and data infrastructures providing services, and therefore creating, let's say, virtual environments where researchers can store, manage, analyze, and reuse data for research purposes. EOSC is planned to become a reality in 2020, and to that end, the EOSCpilot project was funded in 2017 to support the first phase in the development of the EOSC, with the aim to establish the policy environment for the effective implementation of the EOSC and to realize an ethical, open, secure, and cost-effective research environment in Europe. So what about the ethical part of this work? One of the first considerations was that because the EOSC is under development, it is difficult to anticipate the ethical issues that could possibly emerge, and which of them are not already covered by the ethical practice in the different organizations federated in EOSC. So in that sense, an ethical support is necessary to avoid the assumption that ethical practices are taken for granted simply because, you know, we are working in a scientific environment. And that's why we think that governance mechanisms must be in place in order to ensure that ethical issues are appropriately dealt with, but without, let's say, additional hurdles and complex layers, since somehow the EOSC is supporting science and should not risk to, let's say, hamper science. Can you hear me? I can see several messages.
I can hear you, but the sound is occasionally breaking up, and it's clear from the chat that some others perhaps are having.
Okay. So, just a second. I will connect my computer with another internet cable. It should be better, I hope. Sorry for this inconvenience.
Thanks, Serena. That sounds a little better. Do press on.
Okay, can I move on? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So yes, it shouldn't be. I was saying that the EOSC, so in that sense, should not risk to hamper science with additional layer of complexity. Let's say. So in simple words, the ethics white paper. We tried to find a framework for managing ethical issues within EOSC and to look at a broad range of ethical aspects of managing the open science clouds and the data within it. But at the same time, without, let's say, rehearse ethical debates, and we eventually proposed a structure with some mandatory and some optional features. As I said, the principal driver of this activity was the need to identify the possible ethical issues within EOSC functions and processes, and to ensure that those issues are considered and managed in the most appropriate way for the benefit of EOSC itself, its scientific user communities, and the wider European public, to build the necessary trust in EOSC. And this work is based on the conviction that ethical considerations should be an integral part of EOSC decisions and processes from the outset, and not seen as additional or even worse, peripheral to the core scientific endeavor. But of course, there are some constraints and obstacles. First of all, there are different degrees of openness in science, and the term open science is not uniformly applied in different disciplines and scientific practice. Oh, I see there are still some problems with the audio. Kevin, should I move on?
I think you should move on. It seems as if there's one or two with issues, but most people are hearing okay, even if it's breaking up. So I'd press on. Everyone can see your slide. So. Okay,
perfect. So yes, there are some constraints related to the fact that, first of all, the term open science is not uniformly applied in the different disciplines and scientific practice. In addition, the volume, type, and sensitivity also of data stored within EOSC will rapidly expand as the tools to process the data. And in addition, even the legal and social context will evolve, as probably also the governance and management of the EOSC. And last but not least, I would say there are also several potential ethical issues that could be considered and that are represented in this diagram. Very quickly, what we can say is that as the EOSC is designed to support science and data storage, we can identify two main areas, the research ethics on the left-hand side of the screen and data ethics on the right-hand side, where the former is related to research dealing with conflict of interest, maintain research quality, and so on. And the latter is related to the data itself, namely, for instance, fair data. And within these two areas, which obviously are partially overlapping, there are the ethical concerns about the use of personal data and sensitive data, and in particular data that is both personal and sensitive. In addition, there is a set of ethical issues identified as organizational, on the bottom of the slide, related to the governance of EOSC, the federation of organizations, and the practice in EOSC, and other issues related more to science and society, and referring to the ways in which science and society can influence each other. All of these issues are explained and discussed in detail in the white paper, so I encourage you to read the paper here. For the sake of time, I cannot go through. In conclusion, taking into account all of these aspects, the ethical issues and the constraints, we have suggested a layered approach of policies where the initial layer is seen as fundamental and inevitable, with organizational policies that demonstrate that EOSC itself as an organization recognizes and implements ethical practices. And in parallel, there are data management practices that support and enable research integrity, including data provenance, metadata, and so on. Then there are two additional layers that should be implemented. The first consisting of a variety of discipline-specific, time-limited expert task groups to consider specific on by case. And the second one, it's natural extension, let's say, with the establishment of an ethical and legal advisory board, independent from the EOSC executive, coordinating the task groups and contributing to the strategy forums. And last, two other layers that could be developed in later years, providing training materials and addressing science and society debates. So I would stop here for the white paper. I just want to thank all the engagement team and the policy engagement team, and especially the writing group and Steve Canham, who did a tremendous work with the white paper, and apologize for the audio troubles.
Thanks very much for Serena, and indeed, sorry you had to fight through some technical challenges there, but nonetheless, there will be a recording for those who had difficulty following, and I think your slides are really clear as well. And I'll just mention, if you see in the chat, the link to the white paper that summarizes the work of this group dealing with quite a complex technical issue. I strongly recommend you read it. I know many of us have encountered many deliverables from large and complex projects. This is a particularly readable one and a particularly well argued one, and it was an absolute pleasure to read that. So
thank you very much.
As I said before, we'll take questions for all the presenters right at the end of this. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat at any time, but in the interest of time, I'll now hand over to our second presenter, Fergus Sveinsdottir, who's going to talk about ethics in research organizations in the context of EOSC.
Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? Yes, excellent.
Yep.
As Kevin introduced me, my name is Fergus Sveinsdottir. I work at the DCC in Edinburgh. And firstly, I want to thank LIBER and EOSCpilot for inviting me to speak at this webinar. So just to introduce myself, I come from a social science background. I'm a PhD in sociology, and I taught research methods and research ethics for a good many years to all levels of students. I then worked in the private sector doing projects on ethics and also doing ethical assessment of proposals and projects and technologies. So I come from that angle. And one of the things that I did was that I started setting up an ethical assessment board within a small SME that I worked at. So I'll draw a bit on that work as well. I know it's a massive topic. So, and as I always only have about 10 minutes, I just wanted to have this as useful as possible. So maybe point out some ways and tools that organizations and maybe EOSC could use when thinking about structures, procedures, and skills when it comes to ethics and ethical assessment. So this is an overview of my quick talk. So first, I just wanted to refer back to Serena's white paper. And I want to echo what Kevin said. It's a very readable deliverable. It's really clear. Sorry. And I'm very happy to see it takes quite a broad view of ethics. It doesn't only kind of focus on ethics in terms of privacy and data protection. It takes a bigger view as well. And then I just wanted to look at the role of research organizations, so specifically the organizations that will be members to EOSC, and introduce tools that they could use to look at their own ethics assessment boards, or maybe even set them up if they're not already there, methodologies for ethics assessment, and then talk a bit about ethics skills development. So ethics in the EOSC context, so the focus there in the white paper is on the structures, procedures, and skills to ensure responsible research conduct. And I like looking at the white paper because it looks at promoting overall good ethical practice within the broader research community. And it also talks about the importance of ethical practice throughout the research process and data lifecycle. So it's not only about doing a quick ethical assessment at the beginning of a project and then leaving the ethics for good, but it's about thinking ethically about your research questions and take the ethical practice throughout the entire research process. And like I said earlier, it also avoids a very narrow focus on data ethics at the cost of broader focus on research ethics. Because I think I've seen, or I kind of noticed, that with the arrival of the GDPR, the focus on privacy and personal data, sensitivity of personal data has increased, and that is really good. But also, there's been kind of an increased focus on compliance and maybe looking too narrowly at ethics in that one small space and not kind of looking at the bigger picture. Where I think maybe the concepts of research integrity and RRI could be useful as well to broaden the focus. And as the white paper says, it's important to see ethics not as a box-ticking exercise, and it shouldn't be something that is seen as a tedious and adding more red tape to research practice. It should be seen something that kind of flows with the research project. And I think the EOSC could also raise awareness of training tools and opportunities, because there are a lot of projects at the moment who are focusing on RRI and ethics training. And I mentioned some of them towards the end. And I think this could be a good opportunity to kind of highlight the profile of these. And I know also that the EOSC Fair Data Skills Framework is underway. And I think ethics should obviously be a part of this as well. And we have a draft of of the EOSC working groups. And we saw these at a meeting in Amsterdam last week. And there is one on the rules of engagement and also on fair data. And I think maybe ethics could be promoted within these working groups as well. So I just wanted to speak quickly about a very useful tool that I found when setting up ethics structures within research organizations. And it is a very kind of clear and concise document. And they were the result of a 3-year project called Satori. And towards the end, they delivered an extensive ethics assessment framework and 2 CEN workshop agreements on ethics committees and ethics impact assessments. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with CEN workshop agreements, they are a reference document from CEN, which is the European Committee for Standardization. They are not official standards, but they are set up and they're written in a similar way to a standard. So it's kind of a way of reaching a consensus through continuous appraisal and discussion by experts and those who are interested in developing a standard within a specific area. So as you may know with standards, there is a lot of focus on precise wording, on clarity, and kind of explaining processes in very good detail. So these documents were very useful in my work when I was setting up an ethics impact assessment committee within my company. So they may be useful in some way to organizations and the EOSCpilot. So it clearly lines out. So the first part on the ethics committees of the Satori CEN workshop agreement just clearly lays out the objective of an ethics committee is to assess, evaluate, review, appraise, or evaluate practices, products, and uses of research and innovation. And it also mentioned that you could broaden the focus out to include a focus on scientific quality and adequacy of proposals. And you can use it also to evaluate methodologies. And it takes a broad view of the objects of assessment. And it mentions, for example, research proposals, policies, guidelines, tools, innovation goals, projects, protocols, products, and new fields. It has a kind of a long and good chapter on the independence of an ethics committee and who should be involved. And it mentions in a very RRI manner that the affected stakeholders should be involved. There should be experts who are independent and also tied to the organization in question. And it also provides quite clear guidelines on how you would compose an ethics committee, what the focus should be. And I did take out a diagram that they made. So is the focus going to be kind of general ethical principles for all fields of research and innovation? And then you can add in some additional field-specific ethical principles for different types of science and research and innovation. It details the procedures prior, during, and post-ethics assessment, and also outlines a quality assurance mechanism towards the end. So I'm rushing through this because I've only got a few more minutes, but I'll provide links to these documents towards the end so you can have a look at them yourselves. And part 2 of the CEN workshop agreement outlines ethical impact assessment framework, which is a methodology for conducting an ethical impact assessment in research and innovation. So the first step is a threshold analysis, and it gives out kind of like a flow chart to so that it's easy to assess, are there any ethical issues involved and what steps should be taken if there are. It lays out how you may construct an ethical impact assessment plan. It identifies as you identify ethical impacts in consultation with stakeholders. So for example, if you have health research, you should include perhaps patient groups. And it also assists you in evaluating the ethical impacts. So are they quite severe or are they minor? And how you would formulate and implement remedies or ways to attend to these ethical impacts and rectify them. It also gives out a methodology for a review and audit of the ethical impact assessment. So quickly jumping into skills, obviously this is a complex field, and we could undertake a number of approaches suited to different roles, coming from a first stage researcher to leading researchers. Skills development should be ongoing and should aim to drive kind of a nuanced understanding of ethical conduct in the practice of research, and not, again, just focusing on privacy and data protection, although that is a big part of ethics, research ethics. But I think it's always useful to include the concepts of RRI, research integrity, and even open science. I was talking to someone the other day, and they said research ethics are often tied to GDPR compliance, but I think there's a risk there that, and I think this is pointed out in the white paper or a document from the European Commission, that even though research is legal and compliant to the GDPR, it's not automatically ethical. So there need to be kind of a clarification on the similarities and the differences between the two. And although ethics and ethical assessment can benefit from a focus on GDPR compliance in terms of resources being diverted to this part within research organizations, there is a risk of a too narrow focus. And there are a variety of online tools, and there are even ongoing projects at the moment who are developing tools and skills in terms of RRI and ethics. And I just wanted to flag a few up. And one of them is RRI Tools. It's an extensive project, an extensive website, which has a whole section on ethics. The Foster Project, they have a range of online courses on open and ethical science. And here are just a couple of useful tools and resources that I've come across to assist organizations setting up ethical assessment boards or ethical impact assessments. And there's one recent one from the Open Data Institute. I have provided links to part 1 and part 2 of the SEN workshop agreements from Satori. The Norwegian National Research Ethics Committees, they have a vast website. It's very useful with a lot of resources. Again, RRI Tools and Foster, and also a new project called Fit for RRI, which, as you can see from the title, it's fostering improved training tools for responsible research and innovation. And the European Commission document that I spoke about from last year it's like the white paper. It's very clear, it's very concise, and very easy to read. So I would recommend that as well. So yes, I think that's all from me. It's a very quick run through of a complex field, but I hope some of this can help people kind of look further. And so yes, I'll stop now.
Great. Thanks very much, Thordis. So we've heard now a perspective from the considerations, the ethics consideration for EOSC as an infrastructure, the ethics perspectives that need to be taken by researchers and research groups and the organisations that host them. And now we'll hear from Libby on some practical solutions, I think particularly from the point of view of organisations whose primary focus is preserving and providing access to data. So take it away, Libby.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you to EOSC and LIBER for this webinar and the invitation. Well, let me just give a very brief introduction. My background also is social sciences, both sociology and economics, which I did at Berkeley in the US. Then most relevantly moved to the UK and spent almost 15 years at the UK Data Archive there, focusing on a number of areas, but largely research data management, including ethics and handling sensitive and difficult data. And then a couple of years ago, made a migration further in this direction to GISIS to work at the German Data Archive. So yeah, I've been involved in a number of similar exercises with white papers and guidelines and so forth, including with the Economic and Social Research Council, the UK funder, and their ethics frameworks. And given that I spend a lot of time giving workshops and talks to researchers, my experience has been there are a lot of people who are extremely willing and interested to practice more ethically. They need tools. We are looking for really practical solutions about what to do. So that's what I'm going to focus on today for most of my session. Okay, a quick overview. I want to start with the kind of flip of the usual question. We usually think about ethics and think about, oh my God, that means protecting the data, guarding it, not sharing it. I want to ask the question the other way around. Might it not be ethical, or is it ethical not to share the data? I'll go through a couple of examples, then tools, and then close with a little rant about oil. Data is the new oil. I'll keep my rant short, I promise. Okay, some ethical arguments for sharing data. Well, ethics, very crudely, simplifying here, has to do with duties or responsibilities we have to other entities. And I think the three major ones to consider are to participants, to the scientific community, to our peers, and thirdly, to the public. So I think we have a duty to participants, and by participants, I mean anybody we're getting data from, whether they're data subjects, interviews, focus group participants, survey respondents. But to simply use that data one time for our own sort of proprietary project, publish a paper, lock or throw the data away and not share it more widely, I think is actually not responsible use of data. It doesn't make the best voice, it doesn't give participants the most voice for their data. Obviously, this is particularly the case for groups that are over-researched, people with particular medical conditions or kinds of deprivation, vulnerable groups. They get called upon over and over again, and not reusing their data, even though it's sensitive, I think is not acting ethically. A very interesting Finnish study showed that 97% of participants actually wanted to share their data. And this was in spite of the fact that the researchers who'd been involved in those projects were actually convinced that the participants would not have wanted to archive or share their data. So I offer that statistic because I think it is important to know that researchers are in fact actually not always the best judge of what their participants want by way of sharing data. Okay, secondly, to the scientific community. Well, I would say we're not doing so well in this department, and my background partly, as I mentioned, is qualitative data. I don't think replication is the standard, gold standard for all kinds of scientific work, but nonetheless, to not be able to reproduce, replicate, or explain large swathes of social science data is not a good place for us to be in. And to not be transparent and not share data doesn't meet goals of openness. And finally, to the public, yes, I think many of us, not all, but many people are working in institutions. Their research is publicly funded, tax funded, and I think we do have a public benefit there, a public duty to the public to be responsible there. I also think that practically every funding proposal I've ever seen talks something about public benefit, but I think that does mean opening the data as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about a couple of examples. And these are people I've worked with pretty closely who are dealing with a really complicated data and how to both publish it and share it, and having challenges doing that, but they're working really hard to make that possible. So this first example is folks in the UK who are linking Twitter accounts with 3 major UK longitudinal surveys. There's several there. The biggest one, probably the most famous survey, is Understanding Society, and I've given you the link on the key author there. There are many ethical challenges here, not surprising, but one big one is to continue to do this work with the informed consent, meaning informed consent for the research, the data linkage, explaining the complexities of that, the access to the Twitter account, and they're also hoping to publish and archive this data, although the challenges there are great and they haven't gotten that far in the research yet. But nonetheless, a key ethical challenge here is this balance between informed consent and information overload. The more complex our projects get, the more longitudinal, the more data formats, to try to pack, and of course trying to get consent across the research lifecycle, from collecting to using to archiving to sharing. Balancing informed with preventing overload is difficult. So they've done a two-stage process with a short information page. The diagram on the bottom is just the linking, the one on the lower right. They've got these two-tier question systems with first just a simple question, and then you click on a hyperlink to more detailed information. It's pretty simple, not rocket science to implement, but part of it, the reason it matters is that they're trying to also make sure this is compliant with GDPR guidelines about the need, is it granular and layered enough for detailed consent, and they think that they're making that work. So again, experiment in progress, but I think it's a very good effort. Okay, another example, a little bit more technical, but illustrates some key points, especially around the sharing of the data and sharing of new forms of data. So this one is a project on geotagged Twitter posts that were collected in the US. It was built from previous work where the research focus was actually on the representativeness of the Twitter data. But then the second project came along and was really focused on the archiving and the sharing of this data. This was done by a number of my colleagues here at GDPR, and I'll give you that citation on the next slide. So they collected a huge number of tweets, over half a billion, organized the files by time and geography, so day and month, state and county for the US. And okay, it's not big data by natural science standards, but for social science data collection, it's fairly lengthy. It's large, sorry, it is 22 gigabytes. So the panel at the bottom is the catalog record of how this appears, and it has been successfully archived. So let me now go on and say a little bit about how they managed to do that. And not only did it, but did it, I think, ethically, legally, and fairly. And here I mean in the standards of fair, so findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So firstly, those of you working with social media will know this, but you can't actually do much by way of archiving or sharing Twitter content, but only the IDs. This is debated in the community, but usually most people come down and say this is consistent with the Twitter terms of services, which prohibits the sharing of the actual Twitter content beyond the original user. So in order to get a hold of this material, again, the tweet content, you have to take the ID and actually rehydrate and go back to an API or similar technology and get the full tweets. So here they had to be legal, and to be legal, they're archiving only the IDs. So that's one requirement met. Secondly, however, this team was deeply committed to trying to make this material as open as possible, so the data are accessible. However, they are not public. They are not open if you use a very strict definition of open, meaning public, no restrictions. They made this decision to use this condition of available by request because of the fact that the data are not consented, and there is indeed re-identification risk. Obviously, some people use real identifiers for their tweet handles, and certainly with linkage or searching, you can connect many handles to an actual person. The reason I'm raising this case is partly because a lot of people think that this isn't possible, and they think that they don't have any flexibility about the sort of this binary world of data open or closed. But a lot of archives and repositories are getting better with more complex systems for controlling data access. It's not easy and it's not cheap, unfortunately, but we're trying. So they did archive this data in Datorium, which is the self-archiving system here at GDPR where I work, and it's findable. So it's available and citable with this reference as I've given here. More importantly, it's also preserved, and I'm using that here in the technical term of curated and preserved. It has its DOI, and that's a permanent link. So this is an important thing. Again, a lot of researchers think that putting it on their own website or getting it onto GitHub or somewhere else is safe and long-term protected. It's not. It's not going to meet the standards of specialist archives who will preserve this material and make it available for the genuine long term. But finally, this group also really worked to make this material reproducible, not just findable, And in order to do that, the scripts for rehydrating the material, the tools for linking, the tweets to the other content are available, and extensive documentation about how they did all this is available along with the catalog record and the data itself. So this is to make the point, and this is language that's as open as possible but closed when necessary, comes from I think the original EOSC research data management pilot, as I recall, and I think it's been picked up elsewhere for data management advice. It's simply to break the mindset that we have only two choices in this world about sharing and publishing data between open and closed. The world is more complex than that, our data are more complex than that, and we need a guidance standard that deals with that. So this is what I use: open as possible, closed when necessary. So quickly, a few tools, and then I'll close. There are many out there, and again, increasingly that's the problem, is that there's so many they're hard to find, but let me just name two or three here. So the CESDA is an organization of European data archives, mostly focused on the social sciences, and there's this pretty decent, disclaimer, I've been involved in these projects, so disclaimer, but nonetheless, I think the expert guide with this, these 7 categories covers a lot of topics that come up for researchers. More to the point, it is genuinely European in scope, so there are detailed specific things like guidance for GDPR in your country there, and we're trying to expand that to more countries. There are many practical tools like samples of consent forms. Okay, secondly, a book, the Managing and Sharing Guide. Again, co-author on that. The older one is, actually, I'll skip that. A new version should be coming out in about six months. Again, the reason that I'm pleased with that effort is that it's really practical, lots of examples and guidance in it. The publishing Twitter posts is a flow chart produced by the team that I talked about earlier. I think it takes on a couple of really important issues. First, it is practical. It is a usable one-page flow chart for making a decision about publishing. It also answers this question about why, even though data are public, such as most Twitter posts, that is not enough to make a decision about publishing or sharing the data. You have to think more thoroughly, not only about the legal question, but actually about the ethical responsibilities as well. And let me wrap up with a quick point, because I think I'll take one more minute. So is data the new oil? Well, it is in a way. It's valuable and precious. I agree with that. But that seems to lead people to think to this campaign about owning your data, which I have to say as a social scientist just makes no sense to me. What is my data? If I have a social network, that implicates many other people. Do I own their data too? Half my genome is my sister's. Who owns this data? It's pretty tricky, I think, to assign that kind of ownership. More technically, in economics terms, these data doesn't behave like other goods in many ways. My use of data doesn't stop anybody else from using the data, so the goods don't compete in that way. So I don't think data really works like oil. I think it works more like some other kinds of public goods like clean air. I also really dislike the comparison with oil because we thought the unregulated exploitation of oil was a great idea in 1846 when the first well was discovered in the South Caucasus. And that has not led us to a very good situation right now, as I think these pictures illustrate. So I hope we do better with our data than we seem to have done with oil. And I would like us to look forward to a future where we've got our data, sharing it for our common good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Libby, and thanks to all the presenters for keeping us absolutely to time, despite some of the technical challenges we've faced. So we've got about 15 minutes now for questions. I've not seen any appear so far, so I have one for all our presenters, but I encourage you to put some others in the chat here. So we've heard from the perspective both of data archives, of the EOS as a collection, and from ethics from the point of view of individual researchers. One of the feelings I sometimes have is that although ethics and ethics committees in the context of individual research projects, typically collecting their own data, is relatively well understood, a whole set of different challenges emerge when we look at the potential integration of vast numbers of different changing data sets that large infrastructures like EOSC offer us. And I wonder, from the perspective of any of you, do we think that the ethics committees are ready for these challenges, and do we think there's a potential tension or gap in the crossover between the responsibilities of the archives and of the large infrastructures and the responsibilities of individual research groups to behave ethically?
Shall I jump in, Kevin?
If any of you would like to jump in on that, yes, do go ahead.
I'm not sure. You might need to repeat it, so I might go off script. But largely, I think the question was: Are we prepared with the complexity of the data and the scale, given the linkage across infrastructures and data genres?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, in a word, no. But I think a key point that I saw, even working on it or sitting on an ethics committee in the UK and watching the flood of quote unquote new kinds of data come through, whether it was social media or web scraping or anything else, was that no single institution could hold this expertise. So somehow I think we need to work toward like a pool of experts that can be drawn upon for advice in some of these areas. It's just I'm afraid I don't have a clear ideas on the practicalities, but I think it's clear that there's simply too few experts in the area. And the second point is, sorry, I can't think of it right now, so I'll just be quiet.
Okay. Thanks, Libby. I see we've had a question from Angus, which, in a sense, a variation on that, and I wonder if Serena, you'd like to observe this. Are institutional ethics committees working together enough with services responsible for managing data in this area? I imagine that's particularly going to be a concern for the EOSC infrastructures.
Well, to be honest, at this stage of the process, I don't know. I wish that they will work together, and as I said, as we said in the white paper, it's good to have some bodies or board, whatever you want to call them, oversighting and working hands in hand. But the risk is to have a huge workload and a multi-layer scaffold of the EOSC. Then what I know, for instance, I can speak on behalf of the clinical research community, and even for clinical trials, for instance, if you want to perform a multinational clinical trials, you normally have to submit to each national ethics committee. So the big step forward will be very soon with the new regulation for clinical trials. There will be a centralized body, so just one ethics committee in the country coordinating the trial. So I hope that this kind of model, the centralized model, will apply also to EOSC, and having the different working groups really working together. But I'm afraid I don't have much more information to date.
Okay, thanks. So I see another question from Kiko Nunez. which, again, you may wish to respond to, Serena, but I'd encourage everyone potentially may have a view on this. So this is thinking particularly about health data derived from public funds, where I think, as Libby pointed out in her presentation, we almost have an obligation to make as much use of that data as possible. But then there's a question of, is it feasible to do this without the explicit consent of patients? Is this something where we can get wide enough consents initially to allow lots of reuse, or are we obliged to go back and seek consent at each time with the attendant risks of losing contact with the individuals?
Yes, indeed. Actually, you cannot, without an explicit consent, you cannot use health data unless the data is fully anonymized, which raises another problem, what anonymization means, and especially when it comes to health data, the anonymization is complicated because if you remove too much items, the data set is not helpful anymore. So, but sticking to the consent, yes, it's important to collect the consent. For instance, in clinical trials, you can ask for first the consent to enter into the trial, and a second consent broader to the reuse of your data for research purposes, for secondary use. And there is a huge debate, should the consent be broader without specifying the, let's say, the purposes of the research, the field. I don't know, if you enter in a trial for diabetes, so should we specify in the consents that the data can be reused only for other diabetes studies, or should be, open up to other patient stratification studies for other biomarkers? So there is a debate on this. We, as ECRIN, as a European research infrastructure for clinical research, push for a broader consent, but of course for scientific purposes. I really share Libby's vision about the ownership of data. We in clinical research face this problem because usually investigators and hospitals say, this is my data, my data sets, my results, and we really think that data is a public good, and we have also to acknowledge patients for the risk they take in entering for trials, for instance, and this is public money, so the research is funded by public money, and the results should be considered as public goods and be available for further analysis, and also to reduce the number of trials and reduce the risk of patients in participating in trials. And if you're interested, I can give you a link. We prepared a big document on principle and recommendations for sharing data from clinical trials, individual patient data from clinical trials. So I can try to put the link in the chats.
Thanks, Serena. Before we move on to the next couple of questions, I wonder, Libby or Thordis, do you have any response to that question? Particularly, I think, Libby, since you made that point about it sometimes being unethical not to share.
Yeah, I mean, what could I say? I endorse it at the general level, but as Serena points out, it is the complexities of the details. I am reasonably sure that it is going to be legal under GDPR to work with some conceptions of broad consent. How broad can be, obviously a lot of these things are going to play out in actual cases. I think that's why I'm looking more toward the examples like that I talked about with the linking of survey and Twitter data and these kinds of things to see what it's in the doing of these specific cases for me where these challenges are being met. And Tom Emery and others are doing fantastic work with linking and administrative data. I guess where my caution goes up clearly is the unconsented data. And recognizing that there is still a place for that, which I believe, but then it does need to go through other kinds of ethical review, I think, in order to be compliant with some kind of ethical standard that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I think for those who haven't spotted it, Rob Baxter has shared some interesting information about programs in the UK that do this. In Scotland, for instance, a public benefit and privacy panel that's able to assess unconsented health data projects, and that there's work going on in the EOSCpilot project, one of the successor projects to EOSCpilot, on how to operate these things in a cross-border fashion, which is going to be absolutely necessary for that, for the cross-border nature of EOS to work. So we've just got a few minutes left, and I'd like to see if we can briefly deal with one further question, which really goes to the nub, I think, of this cross-border issues and the mixture of service providers and data providers that we're going to expect to see in EOS. So this comes from Gareth O'Neill, and he's asking, how does it work if one uses EOS services that come from commercial service providers on data that has ethical restrictions around it, such as personal medical health data? So are there particular issues that come up just because a service is commercial, or is the EOSC infrastructure going to be able to insulate us from those concerns as researchers?
Well, personally, I think that the key word here is transparency and accountability in EOS. So even for commercial transactions. So as far as the purposes of the reuse of data are clearly defined and there is an agreement upon, I don't see any further problems, but I'm not an expert in ethics. So maybe I will leave the floor to Lydia for this.
Thanks. I mean, I just said my response through to Gareth is my understanding is the EOS governance structures are indeed meant to ensure that we shouldn't be concerned necessarily with who a technical service provider is, because we should be confident that whichever one we use is essentially equivalent from these types of perspective. So apologies, there were a couple more questions coming up there in the chat, but we have reached the end of our time here. So I'll say thanks again to each of our presenters. Thanks to all of you, I think nearly 100 in the end, who joined the webinar and for your questions. Thanks to our colleagues at LIBER who provided the infrastructure to host this, and those at EOSCpilot who drew this together. So a recording is going to be available, and I've taken note of that suggestion that can we provide a transcript of the answers to some of the questions. I'm not sure that's going to be possible, but we'll certainly look into it. So I'm sure all of you have got busy calendars and diaries. Thank you again for your time, and we'll be closing this webinar now.